Okay, welcome everyone to this great talk. We have a special guest today, Mr. Víctor do Prado, Director, Council and the Trade Negotiations Committee Division of the World Trade Organization. And he is going to talk to us about international trade and the way forward after the COVID-19 plunge. So these are very interesting times. We are really very happy to have you here with us, Victor. Let me just share for those who don't know you around the world, but almost everybody knows you, a little bit of your career. Victor do Prado is currently the director of the Council and Trade Negotiations Committee at the WTO, where he assists the preparations for WTO ministerial conferences and oversees the work of the General Counsel and the Dispute Settlement Body. He previously served as Deputy Chief of Staff to the Director General Pascal Lamy from 2005 to 2012. He is a former Brazilian diplomat and held position of the Chairman of the Subsidies Committee. He served as panelist in 3 cases, Argentina Heights, Japan Film, and Canada Periodicals, and was a member of the Brazilian delegation in several WTO dispute settlements proceedings. He was also trade and economic assistant to Brazil's foreign minister from 1997 to 2001. Victor do Prado holds a degree in law from the University of Sao Paulo and a master's degree in international relations from the Brazilian Diplomatic Academy, first of class, Rio Branco Prize Award. He's a member of the board and faculty of the World Trade Institute, Bern University, and was a faculty of the former IELPO, International Economic Law and Policy course at Barcelona University. Victor do Prado is a frequent guest lecturer in universities in Europe, Freie Universität in Berlin, Sciences Po, Oxford University, Georgetown University in the USA, and the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, La Fundação Julio Vargas in Brazil, and El Colegio de México in Mexico. Thank you very much for being with us. You're very welcome, Victor. As in all our great talks, we have a manager of this session who is our Vice President, Manuela Tortora. She will concentrate all the questions that will be addressed to you and put them in a package so that you can answer to them easily. So again, thank you very much. And I will ask Manuela Tortora just to explain us how we're going to manage the meeting. Please, Manuela.
Yes, thank you, Alejandro, and welcome to Victor do Prado to these great talks. The rules of the game are extremely simple. In order to facilitate your task in replying to the questions, if necessary, I will try to concentrate them, but that depends on you in the sense that please write your questions on the column of the chat, questions or comments as you wish, so that then Mr. Victor do Prado can reply easily. We have some problems with the audio because the internet connection is not very reliable today, so I will please kindly ask everybody to close the mic so that the audio can, in theory, improve a little bit. Again, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. Invitation. I am very, very happy to be with Great Talks today. I'm really honored to be here. Alejandro told me that I had 15, 20 minutes or even more to talk, and then that we would go into a Q&A. I have not timed my intervention. It may be, I think, a little bit shorter than that. I would prefer to engage with you in a conversation and answer to any questions, and do this in a more of an interactive conversation than anything. There's a wealth of knowledge gray cells around, and I would like to benefit from your insights and your knowledge as well. I would start by saying that every webinar we attend these days starts with considerations about the COVID-19. I'm getting a little bit fed up with that, to be frank, and I wanted to start my talk taking a little bit of altitude, actually, and instead of talking about only international trade, talk about what is happening in the world, because international trade is only part of that and is in a way even a victim of larger considerations of what is happening in the world. So taking a little bit of altitude here, we are in one of those moments clearly where history seems to accelerate. These are moments when certain trends that we were already observing before and in the few last years, all of a sudden become exacerbated. And I think we all have seen what has happened, starting with geopolitics. So I would start my talk with some considerations on geopolitics, then go into more of economics and industrial production, international trade, and finally make some considerations about the WTO itself. So starting with geopolitics, you all know we are in a moment of increased tensions, increased divisions, more fragmentation, clearly a moment of tensions that nobody would believe would be happening at the time, say, of the creation of the WTO in 1995. The WTO was actually created as a result of the Uruguay round that closed in 1993. That was the moment that Professor Francis Fukuyama, as you all know, declared the end of history. The whole world would be driven by the same characteristics of capitalism, liberal societies, democracy, and etc. Clearly, it's not what we are observing today. And today, if you look around, it looks much more like the world that Professor Eric Hobsbawm, the famous British historian, described in his book, The Age of Extremes, the short 20th century from 1914 to 1991, with lots of isms, right? The communism, socialism, and capitalism, and what have you. It seems like it feels that we're closer to that world of extremes than to a world of the end of history. And I don't have to tell you why this is. I mean, you just open the newspapers and you see the tension between the largest economies in the world. And it's not only tensions that have to do with economics, it's tensions that have to do with power in certain parts of the world. Even the rush for a vaccine for the virus seems to be tainted by a certain geopolitical rush and fight. And this is very troubling because it's clearly a moment when it is difficult to imagine what is the world going to be in 5 or 10 years. And I'm not good in making predictions, but I would certainly say that the world in 5 or 10 years is going to be very different than what we thought the world was going to be 5 or 10 years ago. So we have to revisit our view of the world as of surely last year, and surely as of March this year, when the pandemic started. I think we need to check. Yes, Alejandro.
Go ahead, please, go on.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So I was saying that I think we do need to revisit our view of the world. Moving more to the economics, geoeconomics, if you will, or industrial policies that we're seeing today, and how international trade is developing. Clearly, things have accelerated since the pandemic. And I again insist on this analysis that we are seeing an exacerbation of trends that we had already observed before the pandemic. You are all familiar with the fact that there's this talk of decoupling between China and the United States. It seemed like the economies of the two largest countries in the world seemed to work very well in tandem. Right now, there seems to be less cooperation there, and I'm being very diplomatic here. Clearly, we are seeing a tendency of what the economists call reshoring, so global value chains, products that were at least partly produced in China and in other parts of the world are being repatriated. Sometimes this repatriation of production is encouraged by governments. You have seen that as well. So clearly there's a new trend there. Lots of talk amongst economists and politicians of self-sufficiency, which, I mean, if you spend a bit of time observing the world, is really a myth. I mean, no country can live in and of itself. Even large countries. I mean, shutting your borders completely is not something that is practical or even possible today. Even countries like North Korea do have trade with other parts of the world. But yes, that's very much in fashion these days. Lots of companies stockpiling, if anything, medical stuff, and I think we can understand that. I get a little bit more worried when I see stockpiling of agricultural products and foodstuffs. That to me is much more concerning. We are seeing clearly signs of a recession, probably a depression, a dramatic fall in the prices of commodities, starting with oil, but not only minerals, and if you observe the services, the transportation sector, which is always a good thermometer of the health of world economy, those went down dramatically. Not to talk about the sectors like tourism that have fallen also dramatically. The one sector that has benefited from the crisis and the pandemic clearly is the digital economy. It is indeed the big winner. But again, the digital economy makes it even more apparent the gaps between strong, rich countries and poorer countries and weaker countries. So I think we have that phenomenon as well of strong, powerful countries becoming even more powerful, and poorer, weaker countries becoming poorer and weaker. Go back to my readings in my youth of Hobsbawm. Extremes. It seems like we are going into more and more extremes, and on this clearly the predictions that we have for world economy amongst the institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and here in the WTO are pretty gloomy. World trade falling from anything between 13% to 30%, which is a fall in world trade that we have not seen since World War II. Pretty dramatic numbers for the future, and I mean, we can only hope that they do not materialize. But that is indeed very concerning. So the picture in terms of the economics, again, not bright at all, with some phenomena like the reshoring, reshuffling of supply chains, stockpiling. I do not believe, however, that this means the end of globalization. This is something that many people have said. This is it. Globalization now is going to be returned. Well, it depends on what you understand by globalization. If you think that globalization is a different type of economics that is driven by technological advance, I do not see that happening. I think there is going to be a different type of globalization, surely different trends, but I don't see that we will be stopping using these tools like a Zoom meeting or handsets like we have to not only for our pleasure, but for our professional life, and the same for all types of companies. And this is a phenomenon that I at least also associate with globalization and people doing business all over the world. Clearly, maybe there are trends that show that production is going to be different in the future than what it is now. How about the WTO? How are we doing? And I have many friends here around Geneva who are completely out of the world of trade and the world of international organizations. And they often ask me, so how's the WTO doing? And I reply by asking them, do you know what the W in the WTO is? I said, well, it's the world, right? He said, yes, world. Tell me, how's the world doing? The WTO will do as well as the world is doing. And if the world is not doing too well, don't expect the WTO to do too well, I'm afraid. And that's only normal. We were already suffering from some tensions, as I said, that were there before the pandemic, negotiations that were stalled, and it's not surprising. I mean, this was not a time where many countries were ready to open their markets and lower their tariffs. Very few countries on earth were ready to do that. And surely the types of trade-offs that we had seen in the past between industrial goods and agricultural goods and lowering of tariffs and lowering of subsidies was not very much in fashion. We were seeing other types of negotiations, like, for example, on the digital economy and e-commerce, on fishery subsidies, things that have to do with the environment. That is what members had an interest in, and I think they still have an interest on. But it was not right. Let's put it this way. You add to that the crisis in the appellate body, the fact that the United States had quite a bit of a problem with the way the appellate body was behaving and the way dispute settlement was unfolding here in the WTO. I'm not passing any judgment on that. I'm just stating the facts here. And you have a picture of a WTO that was already in need of reform. And the reform of the WTO is something that several large members had been alluding to, also in the G20 context. Several people were saying we need to reshape the WTO, we need perhaps to reinvent the WTO to make it consistent with with today's economy and with today's world. Now, all of that became sort of left to the side because of the pandemic, because of the difficulties that we had in the beginning of having virtual meetings. We are having virtual meetings now, although some WTO members still find it difficult to accept that we take decisions through virtual meetings, but we're getting there. And by next week, we will be able to reopen one meeting room and have physical meetings here again. The WTO became very active. People said, "Are you working from home?" And I said, "No, I'm not working from home. I'm living in the office." That's what it feels for me. I've been working nonstop on things like the transparency mechanisms that we put in place after countries started notifying measures related to trade in medical products, export restrictions. So we were monitoring all of these measures. Many of the WTO members taking initiatives to ensure that trade remained open. The WTO Secretariat produced a series of analysis of various issues, such as trade in medical goods and the use of electronic devices and the digital economy because of the pandemic. So we've been incredibly busy. But after all of that, we got news at the end of May that our Director General, my compatriot Roberto Azevedo, decided to resign. And since then, I have been extremely busy working with the chairperson of the WTO General Council, that's Ambassador David Walker of New Zealand, establishing the procedures or putting into place the procedures for the selection of the new Director General. And you all know, having probably worked in international organizations or in the international world, how these types of processes drain the energy from other initiatives in an international organization. So most ambassadors now are, what is their number one interest is who is going to be the next WTO Director General, and this race for this job. Let's put it this way: an interesting moment for me, at least as a professional here in the WTO, because we're having to juggle with all of these different challenges. And let me say, I guess the one thing that I've learned through this pandemic is to try to keep cool and avoid negative thoughts. When you're at home isolated, there's lots of negative thoughts that come to your mind. I've been trying to avoid them. I've even learned a bit of meditation with my wife. I've never had any time for that. And I'm finding the benefits of meditation these days. So I guess I'll stop here and over to you, Manuela. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Do Prado. Where the floor is open, I think you put on the table a lot of very interesting things, not only regarding the landscape, which is not very encouraging, I must say, and then more specifically, the WTO within that landscape. So I open the floor, and I see that Alejandro has something, because I do not see something else. For now, Alejandro, please.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Victor, for a very interesting presentation. And indeed, that confirms that we are in a very interesting and challenging moment. You started with your presentation with mentioning the tensions, and that I really couldn't help myself to make a link of one presentation that I witnessed in the process of production of Ferrari cars. And they said that the creation has to be in tension. It's tension that creates things that always push to the extremes, and they go down to reality for the next thing. So I wonder if these tensions, these islamisms, these extremes that we are, and I'm sorry to say this to a Brazilian, but it's indeed like the Maradona's hand of God, that if this crisis hadn't happened, we would be in business as usual. In business as usual. Isn't this something, because we were not doing very well, I think we had delays to reach the objectives. We did very important changes and creation of very important organizations after many deaths, World War I, World War II. This time, it's a pity we're having deaths, but we are in a crisis that is calling us to reflect and to react. I wonder if we had had this crisis, we would be better, or would we just go into the fall, to a harder and stronger fall? Maybe it's a good thing that we are having this crisis now. I also couldn't help myself to make a parallel with the earthquake in Haiti. It's nothing that we're not reconstructing something. We're creating a new foundation for a new something. So we're not going back to what the world was before the crisis, but the thing is, are we going to a better one or to a worse one? So also many reflections, of course, Victor. But I leave it like there so that others can participate.
So do you want me to intervene now or later, Manuela?
Victor, please go ahead. And then I will have two other questions unless there are other interventions from the participants. But please go ahead on the Maradona issue, yes?
Yeah. Right. So, Alejandro, I'm being Brazilian, you know, I'm not a big fan. Let's put it on the, let me give the positive spin. I am more of a fan of Pelé, who is a real gentleman, and I'll leave it at that. So, listen, we don't know. We don't know whether we're going to be better off after this pandemic or not. For one thing, I don't think we have seen the end of it. I think it's too early to declare that this is over. Let's wait and see. I mean, there's a few questions here. Are we in 1939? Are we in 1945? Or are we in 2009 after the financial crisis? And depending on when do you think we are, the response may be different. And perhaps we are just in 2020 and history does not repeat itself, but rather we have to reinvent something new. I, for one, do not believe that it is a completely different world, that what we are going to see in, let's say, in 6 months from now, supposing that there is no second wave and that slowly we find a vaccine and and everything goes back to sort of normal. I don't believe that we are going to have a completely different world. Maybe we're going to reflect more before we do certain things. Maybe we're going to be a little bit more careful in our personal habits, hygiene, and etc. Especially in the Western world. In other parts of the world, things may be different. What I see happening in China, for example, is very much going back to normal as it was, with some changes having to do with the production of industrial production. But for the rest, the news that I have from China is that they are really going back to normal. Normal meaning the world as it was in January 2020. Now, clearly, are we going to take the airplane as often as we did? Maybe not. Maybe we're going to use these means more frequently. Maybe some people are going to use their electric bikes more than they take the car. But is this sort of a earth-shattering event that will change everything? I don't know. I don't think so. I think there is going to be some gradual change. But I also have the feeling, and this is only me, that there's something lacking in all of this crisis, if you will, that we're living, which is attention to international cooperation. The world is too intertwined today for us to completely forget international cooperation. We cannot live without international cooperation. And for us living here in Geneva, this is our bread and butter, right? And I get very worried when I see, people talking about self-sufficiency and let's close our borders. So yeah, long reply to your comment, and I don't think I've even touched on the crux of what you're saying, Alejandro, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor.
Thank you, Victor. Paul Rollian has a question. And then there is my screen, but Paul, please, go ahead.
Thank you, Manuela, and greetings, Victor. Nice to see you, even if it's through a screen.
Nice to see you,
Victor,
Paul.
you mentioned how the pandemic has kind of brought everything to a shuddering stop, or almost to a shuddering stop. But there were, as you said, there were issues on the table in the WTO before this happened. And one of them was the inability of moving the dispute settlement question forward for lack of, well, the details are probably not that important, but there was a blockage there. I was wondering, was there anything on the table? Were there efforts being made, I presume there were, to find some way around this? And if so, what was the nature of those efforts?
Sorry, Paul, you mean negotiations or dispute settlement?
Dispute settlement.
Yes, well, dispute settlement, there was a huge effort done by Ambassador Walker, who last year was the chair of the dispute settlement process. So we had what we called a Walker process, where certain guidelines were agreed, but that clearly was not enough for the United States to withdraw its blockage of the appointment of the appellate body members. So right now there's a group of members led by the European Union and China who have put forward a sort of a parallel mechanism called the multi-party interim arrangement, which tries to replace the appellate body, but it's a small group of members, 21 at this stage, and it doesn't have important members like Japan, for example. So, and of course the United States is not a member. I think the crisis of the appellate body is something that is much deeper than a simple Geneva problem. It's not a Geneva problem. Geneva is the victim, not the source. The source of the problem, of course, as I see it, is the competition between the United States and China, and mostly on issues that have to do with the model of two economic models that are clashing. One model, which is the capitalist model as it is in the United States, and the other model, which some economists call the state capitalism of China. And what we see in Geneva is a clash of these two models. It has to do with the concept of subsidy. What is a government subsidy? And who knows, maybe this crisis also shows that even in the capitalist world, there is going to be a different view of what subsidies are, now that the pandemic is forcing so many of Western governments to disburse gigantic sums of money to support their economies. So some people say, we thought that China was going to become capitalist. Perhaps Europe and the United States are going to become more like China.
Thank you, Victor. There is an interesting comment that Simonetta flagged minutes ago, is the role of trade in the context of development and the SDG framework, but trade has not performed the development role it was expected to play in light of the restrictive measures that were taken recently because of the crisis and ignored the other countries' needs. You mentioned the trade in medical supply just minutes ago in your introduction. Maybe you would like to pick up from there and refer to what is happening or what happened, particularly at the beginning of the crisis.
Sure. And let me say, this relationship between trade and development is something that we pay a lot of attention here in the WTO. And we on, is trade something that fosters development? And not only trade, I mean, I think we need to unpack this relationship between trade and development, right? What does this mean? Does it mean that if you close your country to trade, you're going to develop more? Or does it mean that if you open your country, you will not be able to develop? There's this interesting debate out there about opening your borders to trade and to imports or not. And we have done quite a bit of studies there. So we have done in the past studies together with the ILO in terms of trade and employment. If you open your borders and if you lower your imports tariffs, does that create jobs or destroy jobs? And many people, at least in Europe, think that having higher tariffs, protectionism as we call it, and it's a bad name because protectionism sounds like something good. Everybody likes protection, right? But we think that protectionism, at least in our world, is bad. It doesn't depend solely on trade. And most of the economists will argue that it's not about opening or closing your markets. What promotes development are things like, number one, education. Number two, a sound and reliable judicial system. Number three, investment in infrastructure. Number four, combating corruption. And the list could go on into what many people call good governance. If you have good governance, and on top of it, you do a well thought through opening of markets and increase your trade, you might develop. But don't blame trade for lack of development if you have not invested on education, if you have a corrupt political system, if you have a judicial system that doesn't work, if you have not invested on infrastructure, then please don't blame trade. And this is a very European type of view that, you know, trade does not or may not promote development. When I go to China, or even when I go to Brazil, I listen a completely different narrative. And I guess I'll stop here.
Thank you. In the meanwhile, while others will jump with other questions, I would like to raise myself a concern that I have since the beginning of the crisis. In your introduction, you said you are fed up with the COVID-19 topic, and I fully agree. But in relation to that, just 2 weeks ago, the WHO General Assembly adopted a resolution by consensus saying that the future vaccine and basic medicines needed for the cure of the COVID-19 will be part, of course, of the WHO priorities and be affordable, particularly to vulnerable populations. And this vocabulary, affordable, was repeated in particular by Angela Merkel and the G20 context and other statements by other leaders. And then in that same resolution at the WHO General Assembly, there was a clear sentence introduced, I understand, by the US, China, and Switzerland that ensures that the TRIPS agreement on intellectual property and trade will be preserved as it stands, together with the exceptions that it contains regarding the intellectual property, in this case of the big pharma producing the future vaccine, obviously. So I would like to know what is the WTO feeling on that utilization of the TRIPS agreement as it stands, apparently, in the current and the future, I think, trade in medicines and vaccines. That will be a hot topic as soon as the vaccine will be launched in the market, which is tomorrow, practically. So if you could please share your, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting topic, Manuela, and thank you for bringing it up. So first of all, I do hope that the vaccine is just around the corner. So as the Greeks say, from your lips to God's ear, that we have a vaccine very, very soon. So we're all praying for that. And we are all praying for a vaccine that is available to all, right? With probably, hopefully, with no cost to the population. So that is something that I think every one of us as a person hopes for. I must say that there is quite a bit of misunderstanding about the TRIPS agreement and the WTO agreements as such, because they do contain the flexibilities and the exceptions that allow for the types of situations that we're living today. I think nobody will argue that we are not living in an emergency situation. And by the way, in normal circumstances, the WTO would find that export restrictions are contrary to the agreements. Now, many countries did adopt export restrictions on medical products, for example, and nobody complained about that. So the WTO is not a policeman or a prosecutor that goes after countries saying you have not respected this agreement or that. The WTO is here a forum, and if anyone has a problem with the measures that were taken by others, they will come to the WTO and complain. And mind you, I can tell you, nobody has brought any dispute settlement case against any of the measures, the emergency measures that were taken by some countries. And some of these emergency measures would, if they were questioned here in the WTO, would find that they meet some exceptions if they were non-discriminatory, etc., and if they were not protectionist, etc. So most of these measures were understood by everybody else as necessary in the current circumstances. And I think the same would apply for the vaccine and for the TRIPS agreement. This is a world emergency. It's not, we are not in normal times. And all of these agreements, including the agreement on intellectual property, do foresee exemptions and waivers for times of emergency as we're living today. So if there might be Obruk problems there might be private problems, there might be behavior of companies that we do not control. But as far as governments are concerned, the WTO does cater for these types of flexibilities that I'm talking about.
Yeah, thank you very much for the explanation, which is in fact a confirmation of the role of, as it is in trading medicines and trading vaccines. Simonetta is asking if the crisis of the appellate body will have or is already having an effect on the trade negotiations. Therefore, if you can elaborate a little bit on what you flagged in your introduction in that relationship between the two bodies of the WTO.
Yeah. Sure, and thank you, Simonetta, for the question. It's a very relevant one, because clearly many people here in the WTO are saying, if our dispute settlement function is crippled, why am I going to negotiate new rules that will not be applicable? So you see, there's a very close relationship between dispute settlement and negotiations. And I guess most of the WTO members think that it is still worth it negotiating in the future, especially on issues as the ones I mentioned: agriculture, digital issues, disciplining fishery subsidies because of the exhaustion of fish stocks. By the way, this is one of the Sustainable Development Goals, and clearly there's not only a WTO mandate for this, there's a UN mandate for this, and most of the WTO members are committed to that negotiation. And most of them also think that one way or the other, we will need to find a solution to the appellate body crisis. Clearly, China and the European Union are proposing an interim solution. As I said, not everybody signing up to it as of this stage, and clearly not to the liking of some other countries. But I guess, I mean, most of the people here in the WTO, I mean, the ambassadors with whom I speak, everybody is trying to find solutions in good faith. And I think, since I spoke about good faith, it's important that we keep these principles as basic tenets of international relations. One of the WTO Deputy Director Generals, Alan Wolf, published recently a talk that he gave to a Korean institution, where he talks about going back to key principles of international relations. Principles like reciprocity, principles like predictability, principles like, I mean, let's go back to the very basic. Why was the GATT and then created, and why was the WTO created? What was the ultimate objective of these organizations? The ultimate objective was to try to promote peace. Conversely, try to stop a trend that led to armed conflicts in the 1930s. In the 1930s, you had a protectionist surge and raising of tariffs in the United States, and then in the UK, and then in France and in Canada, that ultimately led to a certain movement in Germany, and the rest of the story you know better than I do. So there was this clear link between protectionism, raising of tariffs, and an armed conflict. So after the war, the idea was, let's prevent that from happening again. So the relationship between trade regulations and peace was very much in people's minds. Maybe it's time for us to go back to these basic principles that somehow we took for granted for decades. Again, sorry for the long reply.
It was not a long reply, it was an appropriate reply. Alejandro, I think you have something to ask. The floor is yours, Alejandro.
Yes, thank you very much, and apologies to everyone for taking the floor again, and particularly just after Victor mentioned good faith of ambassadors and principles, key principles, which is our paramount. I'm afraid that I might lower a little bit the debate now, but with a purpose. With a purpose. In his introduction, Victor mentioned that the W in WTO stands for world, and that the WTO cannot be better than the world. The world is like that. But I also think that making a parallel with international cooperation, international collaboration, and multilateralism cannot be better than the multiple parts. And I see that the parts now are in a particular way and we're in a particular moment of leadership in the world with very different leaders and styles of leadership, not only one, but many, many, if you see the world, leaders are not the traditional historic leaders that we have. I cannot see, you mentioned World War I, World War II, I cannot see the Churchill, I cannot see the De Gaulle now. So who is leading? Isn't it a problem of leadership? Or you just mentioned, you made a parallel with China, a comparison with China. Is it a problem of democracy? Are we choosing the wrong leaders that are not really conducive to collaborate, international collaboration? And I'm afraid even to lower a little bit the debate, if the tools that we have right now, I have the impression that you cannot be elected president right now in any country if you don't support your candidacy in the social media, in getting to the public and giving to the public and to the voters what they want. So now populism, and you can give voters whatever they want, and we're choosing bad leadership, or leadership that is not really attached to principles or to good faith. And in any case, if democracy works, every 3 or 4 years, we're going to change the leadership in the world. So I think we are, I don't know, I feel myself that we are a little bit in a catch-22 situation, that we need leadership. We are asking for leadership, but who is in charge now? You mentioned a fight of the superpowers, a fight and struggle of the less powerful. But who is in charge, and isn't this a reflect of the crisis at the country level and at the leadership at the country level? There are too many. Sorry for that.
Yeah, Alejandro, lots of things going into my mind just now. You know, let me tell you a story. Just before the pandemic, I had lunch with a very, very close friend who's a journalist here in Geneva. And I'm not going to say her name. She's a famous journalist in Geneva. And she was saying, you know, I have been a socialist for all my life. I was fighting in 1968. I went to cover the revolution in Portugal in 1974. And I always believed that democracy was the best system, political system, and that we needed to educate the people so that the people made the right choices. And she said, I'm becoming more and more skeptical about educating the masses. The masses are stupid. Hillary Clinton was right. The masses are deplorable. They choose the wrong people. You know, it impressed me a lot because she is a real leftist socialist, and you know, I always believed in, I always admired her way, and listening this from her saying the masses are just stupid, they choose wrongly. I don't think it's worth educating the masses. I spent a few evenings mulling this over and thinking about this, and then I called her back during the confinement. And I said, listen, I don't think I agree with you. It's not a question of giving up educating the masses. I think there's a mea culpa for all of us in our generation to be done about the distribution of wealth. It's, yes, about education, but it's also about providing decent jobs for people. And I'm speaking to you as a former ILO officer, Alejandro. It's about decent jobs. It's about decent conditions of life. Because what I see is that the masses are probably choosing wrongly in societies that have seen a downgrading in their social conditions. And I see that relationship very clear to me. So you were pointing out to leaders that you know, we may not find the ideal ones. But if I look around at other countries, I also see Angela Merkel there. I also see Prime Minister Abe in Japan. I also see the new president of Uruguay, a small country for sure. Do you know how many people died in Uruguay? Uruguay is a country of 3.5 million inhabitants. So roughly the same, half the population of Switzerland. 23 people died of COVID in the whole of Uruguay. How do you do that? And they're neighbors to Brazil. And you know what the situation in Brazil is. This is called good governance. This is called a country where social conditions are very decent, where you have a fair distribution of wealth. So more and more, I believe that we should focus on that. If there's one criticism of globalization, is that it did create a lot of wealth, but it did not distribute wealth very proficiently. And I think this is one problem that we should be tackling. And I guess, in my view, there is a relationship between that and the politics. Thanks.
Thank you, Victor. Since there are no urgent questions, can I elaborate a little bit on your conclusion and transform my conclusion in another question? Some 12 years ago, more or less, Danny Roderick, the Harvard professor, published an article where he presented a trilemma. So not a dilemma, but a trilemma that you certainly know, where he said, basically, I'm simplifying, of course, if you are a policymaker, president, prime minister of any country, it is very difficult for you to manage the three extremes of the triangle, which are increasing globalization, and mainly he was thinking about increasing trade. On the other hand, you have the danger of increasing nationalism and protectionism, and on the other hand, you have the need to continue building democracy and consolidating democracy. So this trilemma for Danny Roderick is, and I think is still very valid today, precisely in time of crisis, and because of all the factors that you mentioned in your comments. How do you see not only the validity of the trilemma in general, but the role of the WTO now and in the future, insofar as you have a crystal ball, of course, in solving or managing, at least managing this trilemma?
That's an excellent question, Marla. And of course, I mean, I know Danny, and as you would imagine, I don't agree with everything he says and everything he preaches, especially as specifically about the WTO. But I think he did get his trilemma analysis quite right, and I do think it is a real challenge, and it's a challenge. And let me say, I'm going to go back to that piece where he wrote about the trilemma. Now that you mentioned it, I need to reread that because it was very good. For the WTO, and this is also the problem of the whole structure of international organizations. The problem is that we seem to deal with silos, and we're back into the old problem of tackling things in bits and pieces without a holistic view, right? So yes, you need to calibrate trade and protection of your industry. And the third leg, which is democracy, if you ask me, I will say, sorry, you've come to the wrong door. I don't do democracy here. You should go somewhere, go to the UN, go somewhere else. Or if you come to me and say about, you know, jobs and labor, I said, sorry, you have to go up the hill to talk about with Alejandro and his buddies in the ILO. If you talk about health, I said, go to the WHO. So it seems like we are all working in silos without a real holistic view about the problems of the world. Now, I see that the ones who created us in the UN system and in the Bretton Woods system they had that holistic view, right? Because they thought, they saw the relationship between peace and economics and jobs. Remember, the Havana Charter, which was supposed to have created the UN International Trade Organization, was about labor as well, and was about social conditions as well. The Havana Charter was a much bigger endeavor than the GATT, which ended up being the benchmark for trade. So I think that trilemma is still there. What worries me though, Manuela, is that people seem to have gone back to what my former boss Pascal Lamy called a Westphalian world, where the nation state is the sovereign. So it seems like everybody now trusts only the nation state to solve all of their problems. I do feel that crisis of multilateralism very, very much in my daily work. We are in a moment when there seems to be less and less international cooperation. And I think our challenge is to show not only to government, but to people. I mean, I have a brother who's a veterinarian in the backlands of Sao Paulo. If I tell him the crisis of multilateralism, he doesn't understand what that means. I will probably have to use a metaphor and say, you know, in the city where you live, you have problems that have to do with the whole community. You don't expect the mayor to solve that problem alone. You get together in the city council and you discuss it. Very much like here in Switzerland, you go to the commune and you discuss the problems in a collegial manner. Well, the world, if it is a big village, should be the same. We should be discussing the problems in a collegial manner rather than trusting that one person, one president in each country can solve all the problems of the world. Clearly, we're not going to solve the pandemic by a simple national lockdown. We're not going to solve climate change by each country in its own. I mean, it's obvious, isn't it? Viruses don't respect borders. Clouds don't respect borders. We clearly need global solutions for these global problems. But it seems like, you know, in politics, everything is local these days. And there's this trend of going inward, which I find worrying. So I think we do need that global view again, and Danny's trilemma is only going to be addressed if we have a holistic view. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I would like to refer to one of the silos, which is also a horizontal, holistic question at the same time, which is the women's empowerment issue. Simonetta is raising the question, what will happen with the WTO Ministerial Declaration on Women's Economic Empowerment and Trade? So certainly that's an issue that is not a small detail. I think it's the overall women's issue that have to be seen in a holistic fashion. But what is the WTO thinking on that, or your own thinking on that?
Well, first of all, I think this is a very, very important issue. We had I'm one of these gender champions myself. I have a vast majority of women in my division, so all in favor. And I have a daughter myself, so that makes you think, right? So I'm all in favor of women economic empowerment, and we are trying to assist a group of WTO members who has launched this initiative at our last ministerial conference in Buenos Aires on women economic empowerment. We hope that they will reinforce their initiative at the next ministerial conference. And meanwhile, we have been talking to many companies as well who are engaged on this issue. For example, the head of government relations of UPS has a very interesting initiative to ask all WTO members to include in their services schedule a non-discrimination clause for services provided by women. It sounds weird, right? So why would you do that? Well, because in many countries there are still discriminatory laws on provision of services by women, from simple things like I had a call there. So from owning and driving a taxi to providing truck services, again, as a driver, or all types of services that in some countries, legislation still says that they are exclusively for men. This is clearly wrong, right? So I think that, I mean, an initiative like this of having a commitment of non-discrimination in tribes is something that would have, I mean, this would become hard law. This is something that would have, the effect of any other WTO treaty would be something very, very welcome. Now, I can see resistance on the part of some countries as well. So I think it's all the more important that at least those who support the women economic empowerment agenda, that they start doing this on a unilateral basis. Don't wait for the others to take these commitments on women economic empowerment. Take the lead and do it yourself, and take this firm legal commitment yourself.
Thank you so much. Other questions or comments? I have one myself, but I will keep it for the end because it is a tough one, and you can already imagine which question it is. It concerns, of course, one of the WTO member states that you mentioned in your introduction. And what could happen if the US formally announces that its intention to withdraw from the WTO?
I'm really sorry, Manuela. I will do as my boss does. I don't deal with hypotheticals.
Very good.
Give me hard facts, and we'll deal with them. So
good.
I won't do that.
Sure. Just a propaganda here. One of our next great talks in 2 weeks from now, on the 23rd of June, will be with somebody who you know very well, who is Craig Van Krastek, who will talk about the current US foreign policy and world issues in the current context of the crisis. So it's not specifically on the WTO, but I'm pretty sure that obviously the issue will come on the table. Of course, you are kindly invited to participate if you want to join us. We can send, Alejandro will send you the link is the same, but the date and the time is 3 o'clock in Geneva time, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 9 o'clock Washington time for Craig. I do not see.
I mean, you couldn't have chosen better. Craig is a great guy. He is just, I mean, he's a good friend too. We used to teach together in Barcelona. He wrote the best history of the GATT and the WTO. His last book on US trade policy is a masterpiece. So congratulations to you for having invited Craig. When is this again? Is this next week?
On the 20th, no, in 2 weeks from now, on the 23rd of June. So it's Tuesday in 2 weeks from now, but we will send you the link.
I would love to be there and to
Absolutely.
see Craig, because I always admire him and would really love to ask him a few questions as well.
Exactly, I thought about it, yes. Craig is one of my best friends, so that's also how I got it, because he's extremely busy these days.
Yeah.
But I would love to have you on board at the same time.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Manuela.
Alejandro, I will give you the floor for some conclusions, if there are conclusions, or anyway, saying goodbye and thank you to everybody.
Yes, indeed.
It was a great talk.
I wouldn't dare to conclude on anything that Victor just mentioned. It gives so much food for thought that it's really incredible. I'm happy that we will continue the discussions, and we were extremely grateful for you participating today with us, Victor, and for your continued collaboration with the Gray Cells. I think the first time you collaborated with us was already 3 years ago, and you are so kind that you are already accepting to collaborate with us in our activities in Singapore, which with universities in Singapore that will come during the year. We're extremely grateful for all that, because we know you're extremely busy and with lots of tensions, and as you mentioned in your introduction. Thank you very much indeed. We're hoping that the déconfinement in Geneva will start. We're hoping to go back to the port by WTO, and we're hoping to organize a Gray Cells barbecue. So we will let you know to get together in a more informal way, not far from your office. Thank you very much indeed. Take care, stay safe, and again, many, many thanks, Victor.
Thanks, Alejandro. Thanks, Manuela, and thanks, everyone. And I hope to see you all soon. Stay healthy and safe. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.